star. We got the band back together, which is to say we got a group of rock star panelists to get going on what is our last in a series about the election. Been happy to do that and get started. Alan, I see you here. Do you have a few opening words? I don't want to steal your thunder.
Sure. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and good evening. This is the what we'll call the mid to post-election panel, and this will be a debate and I guess according to Dan, some musical entertainment. This is hosted by the Northwestern Pritzker Law Alumni Clubs of DC and New York, and I'm the co-chair of the New York Club Board. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's event, which is the final session of our 5-part Election 2020 virtual speaker series. Over the last several weeks, we've been excited to host several lively post-debate discussions with some of our most prestigious faculty and alumni. A few housekeeping measures. Because we have such a large audience on this call, the live chat function will remain off throughout the program. However, the audience will have an opportunity to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to be answered in the latter part of the program. Finally, this program is being recorded. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, Daniel B. Rodriguez, Harold Washington Professor at the School of Law, who served as Dean of the Law School from January 2012 through August 2018. And I'm excited to turn it over to Professor Rodriguez to lead tonight's program.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Really appreciate it. Let me take the opportunity to thank the Alumni Association and also our hardworking folks in Alumni Relations and Development for putting this together. When they labeled this program post-election, I suspect they meant it. And so it's not that, but what it is an opportunity to bring together just an illustrious group to talk about all matters in connection with the election, with special focus on the presidential election. We're happy to have, as I said before, an all-star group to join us. So in no particular order, it's my pleasure to welcome back to Northwestern, albeit virtually, our alum Kate Shaw, a graduate of 2006. Seems only like yesterday, maybe not for you, but Kate is a professor at Cardozo, Benjamin Cardozo School of Law in New York, where she teaches and writes in various areas, including executive power, the law of democracy, Supreme Court practice, and reproductive rights and justice. She is a contributor for ABC News on a variety of issues, including the election. And she is the co-host of a fabulous podcast on the Supreme Court. If you haven't checked it out, you need to check out Strict Scrutiny. I'm also delighted to welcome back our friend and illustrious alumnus, Carter Phillips, graduate of the class of 1977. He is a co-director, among other great accomplishments, at Sidley, Austin, and in legal practice, he's the co-director of our Supreme Court clinic at Northwestern, former law clerk for Chief Justice Berger. And let this settle in for a moment when I say that Carter has argued 88 cases and counting before the Supreme Court of the United States. And I'm also delighted to welcome my colleague, Jason DeSanto, senior lecturer here at the law school, teaches in the area of law and public advocacy. He's a speechwriter and communications professional and consultant for a variety of folks, and in particular has been a consultant on debate strategy for Democratic candidates for the House and the Senate. So let's jump right in. What do you, the caveat is appropriate. We are, as we speak at the moment, we do not know who the next president of the United States will be. So we will be dwelling, as lawyers and law professors do, a little bit in the realm of the hypothetical, as it were. But I want to say in the real realm where we don't know who will be elected, who will be our next president. I want to ask, and let me start with you, Carter. What are you looking to see in the next hours and the next days? Let's, God forbid, we're talking about the next weeks. But what would be particularly important for you as a bellwether or signal of how things are going to turn out?
Well, to be honest with you, what I hope, for the sake of at least my own peace of mind, certainly my family's peace of mind, is that the results in Pennsylvania will show up with the ballots that were mailed and received by the day of election, showing a sufficiently large number that Pennsylvania goes to Biden, and then all of the rest of this is beside the point. Because if it goes any other way, my guess is there will be weeks before we'll really have an answer to who wins. And my guess is we'll probably have protracted litigation. So it would certainly save me, and I think a lot of other people, a lot of heartache if Pennsylvania ultimately were to come out the right way. Now that's, there's still a lot of votes out there and a big hill for the vice president to climb to get there. But that would make my life easier, I suppose, or at least I'd feel more comfortable.
So let me jump right into the arithmetic and ask you a question, Carter, and then I'd love to get the reactions of Kate and Jason as well. Do you mention Pennsylvania because, I'll try to ask this in a way that's not a multiple choice question. Is it because it's the larger state and it gets Biden over the hump, or because, as we've heard in the last few hours, there seems to be an indication that they will be able to count their votes, their final votes, sooner than will Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia? Because, of course, as you know, the arithmetic would suggest that if Arizona and Nevada turn out, that would be enough to put him over the hump.
Yeah, it's both of those. I mean, both of those factors are part of it. The other consideration is, frankly, the litigation has already started with respect to Pennsylvania. We know there's a division within the court about what votes to count and what votes not to count, and if Pennsylvania becomes the swing, and which votes count, and which votes don't count become critical, then you end up with the Supreme Court stuck right in the middle in much the same way it happened in 2000. And I don't think, at least I personally don't want to see that happen again. And I suspect a fair number of people would prefer that not happen again.
Great. Well, we'll be circling back to the court's role, Supreme Court and other courts. But Kate, same question, same answer, or what are you looking at?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Carter's right. And maybe to give a little bit of context regarding the kind of the last few weeks and Pennsylvania specifically, I think that the reason, I think one, because it is this large electoral college vote prize and thus would decisively hand Vice President Biden a victory, and then sort of regardless of who pulls ahead in the very, tightly divided Georgia and Nevada and Arizona contests, Biden prevails. I think that's the math. Even if Trump gets 2 of those 3, I think that's still the case.
Right.
Somebody checked in if he gets 3, I think, but I don't. In fact, the likelihood of Trump getting all 3 seems exceedingly low. Right. But the Pennsylvania background is that the Supreme Court has twice now turned away state GOP efforts to get, prior to the election, the Supreme Court to reverse a state Supreme Court ruling that allowed for the counting of absentee ballots that arrive by tomorrow. And so that is right now the legal background against which these Pennsylvania workers are operating, with one important caveat, which is that they are segregating the ballots that arrive after the end of the day on Tuesday. So the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday arrivals have not been counted yet, because the Supreme Court, in its second encounter with this request to reverse the Pennsylvania, or to stay the decision of this Pennsylvania Supreme Court, sent a relatively strong signal that there was an open question about whether they actually did believe that these ballots should not be counted, at least that 3 of them believe that. So Justice Alito wrote an opinion joined by Gorsuch and Thomas that seemed quite dubious about the logic of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that allowed for this extension of the return deadline until Friday. So that's 3, it's not 4. That I think is a significant difference, but it was also an 8-member court. So one of the potential votes for that position wasn't even in place yet. And that, of course, is Justice Amy Coney Barrett. It would be great if the court never had to take another look at this Pennsylvania case, because I think it would put the court in an extraordinarily difficult position. And I think that the cross pressures upon Justice Barrett, if she were sympathetic to the position that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court essentially exceeded its authority by reading a state constitutional provision in a way that was arguably in tension with the legislative provision setting the deadline for return of ballots. But as a sort of first move as a new justice on the Supreme Court to cast a vote that would certainly appear to many as, kind of a political, kind of return favor to the president who had just on this very accelerated timetable put her on the Supreme Court, I think would be a very serious blow to her own kind of, very new legacy in the Supreme Court, and also to the court as an institution more broadly. Much prefer that the court never has to inject itself into the Pennsylvania question again. And I think that it's right. It looks, so both Dan and Carter have been really cautious in terms of projecting the ultimate result of the election. And I think that's a good and lawyerly position to take. But I think we also should say that it seems there's a very significant likelihood that Joe Biden will be the next president, will be inaugurated on January 20th, whatever the path to getting there is. And I don't think we need to beat around the bush about that. That is very much the odds-on likelihood from where we stand right now.
Seems to increase as the hours go on. I certainly want to circle back to the Pennsylvania case because it's absolutely critical, as both of you have noted. But let me give Jason a chance. I'm going to ask you a little bit of an unfair question because I'm going to push you, Jason, to answer it in a way that doesn't involve Pennsylvania. Is there anything else that's going on that might a moving part in all of this that you're looking after, in addition to Pennsylvania, let's say that.
Sure. Okay, so to your top line question, Dan, about what it is that I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is a way forward together as a country. After everything that's happened, after Election Day proper, after the few days that follow, and however long it takes to count votes, to reconstitute the body politic. And a lot of that will come from a vote total that is definitive, and a lot of it will come from the way that we usually reconstitute ourselves, which is through language and communication and pulling people together. Now, to the first point about something definitive, I will take the bait and I will not talk about Pennsylvania. And so what I would say is that if a state like Georgia were to come through for Biden,
and apparently it's just so everyone's on the same page, at last count it's below 10,000. Albeit with not a lot of votes to count, but there's an arithmetical route for Biden winning Georgia. However likely it is, we'll see.
If that were to happen, along with, say, Arizona and Nevada, in conjunction with former blue wall states like Michigan and Wisconsin, even if the margin of victory in those states were relatively small, that would be geographically diverse. It would in some ways echo what Trump pulled off 4 years ago, which might be relatively narrow victories in a number of states, but in a diverse enough constellation where people understood what had happened.
And states that it would have been flipped, right? Certainly Arizona, I think Nevada too. Didn't Trump
No, Nevada was Democratic the last time around. So this would be Arizona and Georgia as flipped, along with Michigan and Wisconsin. And that would offer a measure of, let's say, at least on the surface, a way to bring people together. Now, we can get into the question later of how likely that is, given how polarized we are. I will say one thing about Pennsylvania, though, because I have to. And so I'm disregarding what you said.
Okay.
I apologize.
About Pennsylvania. It's okay. Keystone State and all that.
Yes, to what Kate and Carter said previously about the legal machinations and the danger about Coney Barrett becoming involved in all of this. The other component is purely political. To most people, they understand that what happened the last time around was that formerly Democratic states in the upper Midwest were flipped by a group of voters to Donald Trump in that election. Right. If all three of those states were to flip back, similar voting patterns, but just flipped from Republican to Democrat, there would be, I think in one sense, an understanding and an understandable takeaway for people about what happened in this race that from a political perspective, I think would be easier for people to accept and understand. And I'll simply leave that there.
Let me push you just a little bit on that. Even if Biden is successful in pulling out Pennsylvania, he's not going to pull it out by a lot, right? I mean, the margins may not be as substantial as they were before. I'm just saying that from the other point of view. Trump crushed Biden in Ohio more than certainly the pollsters indicate, and I mean, so you see where I'm going is that we talk about the blue wave as a defensive matter, but it's not that there's been this enormous, massive return to, let's say, what happened in Illinois.
Yeah, I don't want to quibble over the margins there, but I think if we look, for example, at just Wisconsin and Michigan, we're going to see in Wisconsin that Trump won in 2016 by 20,000 votes. Biden will have prevailed by approximately the same amount this time around. The real difference is in Michigan, where Trump prevailed by 10,000 votes in 2016, and Biden will have won by, at this point, anywhere from 150 to 175,000 votes.
Right. Yep.
So that is more substantial, and I think goes to your question about the margin of victory in those so-called blue wall states. The Pennsylvania margin in 2016 was 44,000, and I think it's conceivable that after Allegheny County comes in, and then Philadelphia as well, I guess Philadelphia would come in first, that we might see something akin to that, if not more. It's pure speculation, but to answer your question, I think there would be a case that this was just the flip of that. And if we dug a little deeper into the numbers, we might see how that actually happened. And that, from a narrative perspective, is something that people might understand, believe, and gain some consensus around going forward.
Great. Kate, let me come back to you on the Pennsylvania case that you laid out for us so well. So first question, did the three justices who really set this warning shot across the bow, right, in the case as it came up, which obviously was about expedited review, how much of a warning shot is it across the bow? Were you surprised, and how much did we learn from the fact that three justices, I mean, not silently, conspicuously said, we may consider this in another case? How significant is that before we even get to the Barrett issue?
I thought it was significant. I was troubled by what seemed to be the absence of consideration of the reliance interests of the voters who, now again, this was an opinion leaving the door open to a potential, further encounter with these questions. But I didn't see anywhere in this short writing even an acknowledgement of the fact that any, further consideration would happen against the backdrop of votes cast by Pennsylvanians in good faith, in reliance on a state Supreme Court ruling that had been undisturbed by the US Supreme Court that said their votes would be counted. I mean, that seems to me to require such a grievous legal error to warrant the court's intervention. I'm not even sure if it would ever be appropriate, but certainly you have to take seriously the reliance interest that would be at stake. And I was really troubled not to see that even, given a nod in that separate writing. It was an odd, I'd love to hear. Well, Carter has to, if Carter has any views about this, but I mean, two other things I'll say. I said this before, but I did think that the withholding of the Kavanaugh join there seemed significant, especially because from other writings in this kind of pre-election shadow docket, he had signaled some sympathy for the general legal view in that opinion. But there was also this kind of peculiar sentence at the beginning of the Alito opinion, or of the court's opinion, that said that further writings might be forthcoming or something to that effect, which is not something you ever really see in Supreme Court opinions, at least that I can recall, though I'm sure Carter will correct me if I'm wrong. So of course, the question that immediately sprang to mind for me is, is it Kavanaugh who has something to say, but I think actually responsibly doesn't want to stand in the way of a speedy resolution right now, but, doesn't necessarily want his silence to be read as disagreement with those three. So I don't want to overread his absence either. But so then if in fact he in some way would agree with that position, then it would really all come down to Justice Barrett. And there would be, I think, recusal questions and then questions about if she did participate on the merits, where she would come down. We don't have any clues from her writing on the Seventh Circuit what she would make of this kind of argument.
Sure. Carter.
Well, I mean, I agree completely with Kate in terms of the reliance interests. I mean, I think if the court really wanted to say, look, the state Supreme Court simply is not permitted to stand in the shoes of the legislature within the meaning of the constitutional provision that's an issue, and therefore it's a simply inappropriate way to go. They should have said it then. This was their opportunity. Even if you only have 8 justices, you get your 4 to say we're going to hear it. You takes your you pays your money. You takes your chances. They didn't do that. I think it would be remarkably irresponsible to come back later and try to do anything with respect to Pennsylvania. Now, maybe you do it's not moot because it's capable of repetition, yet evading review, and we'll have another election in 4 years, and there may be another state where the state Supreme Court decides to respond to an unimaginable health crisis by changing the rules of the game in some way, and therefore you'll know going forward whether or not that's permissible. But it would be sad for the court as an institution, I think, if it turned out the way Kate described it a few minutes ago, which is these votes become the pivotal votes to the outcome of this, and the Supreme Court becomes the pivotal decision maker on whether or not those votes are actually valid or not.
There is some chatter. I shouldn't say chatter. That sounds pejorative. Some conversation across some of the news outlets in the last few hours, led by a number of Republicans. I saw the former Senator Santorum was commenting on this just a couple hours ago, that is casting doubt on whether the Secretary of State is in fact segregating the ballots. And there seems to be some grumbling that maybe they're not honoring what the Supreme Court said they had to do. Now, I don't know whether that's accurate or inaccurate, or whether that's just a talking point. But let's just suppose that there was some commingling, that in the midst of this maelstrom of vote counting and all of that, they haven't honored it. Does that change your priors, either of you? Do you think that the Supreme Court at some point says, no, time out. You said you were going to segregate the ballot. That's what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said you had to do, and now you're not honoring that. Does that put what Pennsylvania is doing in jeopardy?
Well, you'd still have to go back through the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. If they're the ones who created the obligation, you're going to have to go there. You're going to have to litigate it, and so you have to litigate it in the state court system. I mean, I find it hard to imagine that the state Supreme Court would say, well, you're not segregating, even though you told us you were going to, and we assumed you would when we went forward onto these circumstances, but forget about it. Just go ahead and dump them all together and count them as if nothing had happened. Then I could imagine, I mean, in no circumstance could I see the U.S. Supreme Court say, whoa, wait a second. Yeah. But I don't think the Pennsylvania Supreme Court would do that. I also find it inconceivable.
Right. Yeah, that's right. It's a factual question.
I mean, everything is videotaped everywhere. I mean, I don't talk about a transparent process. It's hard to imagine how anybody can do too much shenanigans the way our electoral process works these days, especially with everybody literally having a phone.
Right. Kate has said that she and Kate, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing your view, that Justice Barrett should recuse herself. She should not get into this. Actually, let me ask you that question first, and I'm going to turn back to you, Carter, and see whether you agree or disagree. So is that your position? She should?
I mean, certainly not in all litigation involving President Trump.
No. And I was just on this case. Yeah, the Pennsylvania case.
Well, and maybe even more broadly in any, of these, any election cases that would be outcome determinative. I think that largely because of the conduct and rhetoric of President Trump, there is enough of an appearance of bias or impropriety that would attach to her participation in any of these cases that I think there is a strong argument for her recusal. And again, not because of anything that she did or said, although I will say that I found pretty troubling during her confirmation hearings, her kind of repeated unwillingness to distance herself from any of the claims made by President Trump in a way that, even Gorsuch, when he was before the committee, in general terms, he described it as demoralizing and disheartening when, politicians attacked federal judges. He didn't name Trump, but it was obvious what he was responding to. I actually thought that was kind of an important moment. And Barrett was asked questions like, does the president have the unilateral authority to move the date of the election? And should presidents publicly commit to the peaceful transfer of power? And those seem like, obvious, uncontroversial
the Ginsburg
propositions.
answer, right? I can't. Yeah,
I can't say. And, and I remember, even, and look back at Roberts' transcript after this, Roberts was given some hypos that, were not so outlandish. This is like, 2005, War on Terror, was asked a question about internment of a group on the basis of race or religion. And he could well have said that kind of case could come before the Supreme Court. And that would have been, a reasonable thing to say. And instead he said, I can't imagine an argument. I suppose we could have a case like that. I can't imagine an argument. I can't imagine what an argument in defense of it or something like that. So, sometimes you have to be willing to draw lines. And I think it would have been a very low cost line for her to draw to say, obviously, presidents should, or a politician should commit to the peaceful transfer of power. And I'm not aware of any argument in defense of a president's unilateral power to change the date of an election.
Seems like a mom and apple pie point.
Yeah. And there were more. Those are just two examples. And I do think that the combination of some of the president's claims, both, around her nomination process and even in the last few days, broadcasting this confidence that his Supreme Court will basically bring it home for him, does put her in a basically impossible position. And it would be prudent for her, for the court, for the country to recuse. And I say all that knowing that it's, of course, entirely within her discretion. I would imagine, or I think there's a chance, at least, the Chief Justice, whose guidance I presume she would seek and take seriously in this kind of thing, would, himself having responded publicly to some of the president's rhetoric attacking judges, might be concerned about some of the institutional legitimacy kinds of issues that I've just described. And he might sort of weigh in that direction, but I'm not sure. But yeah, that is my view. Knowing that it's something that is going to be up to her ultimately.
So, Kate, can I just, on the slippery slope of that, though, President Trump has talked about his justices, the three of them, not just the one. Yeah. So under your logic, maybe, is there a case for both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh saying?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that and even if this were, a case in which she was his most recent appointee, but there had not been this kind of breakneck timeline on which his party had rushed, that he had nominated her, the Senate had rushed to confirm her. I even think her decision to participate in the South, not the Rose Garden ceremony that became the super spreader event. Obviously, I thought that was ill-advised, but that, you know, an hour or two after her confirmation,
The Evita event, right?
Right, with the sort of,
balcony,
the two of them on the balcony, was also something she could easily have declined to participate in, right? It was cut as a campaign ad about 12 hours later. And, you know, the president has no formal power over her at this point. I mean, you know, he wasn't going to pull her nomination anyway, but at least you can sort of understand not maybe wanting to anger him while the nomination was still pending in the Senate. When it was done, there was no need to be responsive to his desires to, you know, to basically put on a political event in the White House. And that too, I thought, didn't send a very strong signal of kind of judicial independence, despite her, you know, remarks sort of touching on those themes.
Sure.
I just think that all of that distinguishes her, the timing and her participation in those events distinguishes her case from that of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh in a way that I think that is significant. And I wouldn't make the argument that either would have an obligation to recuse.
So Carter, I want to come to you on this point, but if I may, not only just on the question of Barrett and recusal, but the broader. You've seen a lot, right? You've seen, you know, the Supreme Court in this. Is there an unseemliness fact? That's not what I meant, but I'll stand by. You've seen a lot. You know, how unusual is this? I mean, I don't mean just the election controversies, but these justices put in an incredibly difficult position. Right, given Trump saying, you know, calling them out, my justices, does it affect Barrett's recusal? Does it affect, practically speaking, or should it, judgments made by Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, et cetera?
Well, you know, it's hard to think of anything quite like this. Although if you look back on what was the biggest political issue of the last 48 years, I suppose it was the Affordable Care Act. It was very politically hotly charged, and obviously went to the court in that way, and it split 5-4 with the Chief Justice taking a position that is the kind of an argument that only lawyers can love, that, you know, the act violates the Commerce Clause, but nevertheless is okay under the Taxing Clause.
Right. I don't know about you, but even as I teach that case, I find it more confusing each time I teach it.
Yes,
right?
well, I think you're in good company in that regard, and obviously the Chief Justice was being buffeted around by all kinds of different tugs, and behaved the way he did, and the Affordable Care Act was saved, and reputation of the court probably to some extent was enhanced. You know, so now you're in a flip side situation. You go back to Bush versus Gore. Obviously, that was less that either Bush or Gore had any immediate contact with any of the individual justices, but it's still split right along political lines, if not ideological lines, because the ideology didn't exactly work out perfectly if you take federalism as an important principle. So here, you're dealing with a situation where it would be interesting to see if she were to recuse herself, and the others didn't. Then now you've got an 8-member court. It would be fascinating if it just went away because of a cert denied and she recused, and you have the 3 dissenters who you already knew would have taken the case, or at least were not happy with the decision below. My guess is that's not the end of the world if that happens. The court, you know, dodges a bullet. You know, much worse, I guess, if the court actually grants and it comes out to be 5-4, and she ultimately is the 5th vote, as Kate says. I mean, it's kind of hard to think that your legacy may very well be decided on the basis of virtually the first action you ever took on anything of significance. You know, most justices' first act of any significance is either kind of an oral argument, which is not all that big a deal, especially now that they do them by telephone, or, you know, your first opinion is usually a 9-0 decision that nobody ever remembers except for the poor schmo who lost it. I know that from
you having been that poor schmo, right?
I believe his first opinion, I lost 9-0, so I remember vividly. I know
too soon.
Exactly. So to get thrown into that maelstrom is really hard to imagine, and I would guess that there would be a lot of effort by the court to try to figure out if there was some way to avoid that outcome, which I'm sure goes back to what I said at the beginning. I suspect if you ask the justices to give you a silent poll, they would say, I hope Pennsylvania goes for the vice president by enough that this issue goes away and we can just not think about it for another 4 years at least.
Got it. Jason, I want to circle back to you, and before we leave the court, at least for now, there's a picture that you paint about getting, if not consensus, then being able to I forget exactly how you put it, but having the resolution and being able to come together, right? And no one would describe Bush versus Gore as in any sense coming together, but the coming together moment was Vice President Gore, right, conceding very soon thereafter. Now, whether that was he would have had any other challenges or what have you, he made that judgment, and that was a resolution. So could the court have that kind of moment for us? Could we've been talking about Chief Justice Roberts, could he write an opinion, not uniting the court, but basically saying, we're putting this to rest, it's over, you need to turn the page? Or is that expecting too much of our judiciary?
I think ultimately that cannot come from the court.
Okay, so where does it come?
Well, I think Kate's point about Robert's recognition of the institution is more than relevant, and the legitimacy of the institution. Some of that can come from the way that the court conducts itself. Some of that can come from the opinions that it drafts. But ultimately, throughout the culture, the court speaks not just through its opinions, it also speaks through and by people who are in negotiation with the court, the litigants. Mm-hmm. And you hit it on the head when you talked about Gore. When Gore came out on December 8th, 2000, about a month after the election itself, he and Bush had been having daily meet and greets with the press, or Lieberman had, or Cheney. People have been coming out for a month, stating their position in their own styles, Gore doing it in a more formal way, Bush doing it out at the ranch. And so there was this discussion, this discourse about the court cases that were going on and whether they were legitimate. And we were always in those discussions, right? It's the old truism about the court doesn't have an army. And what that means is that there has to be a public consensus about the court's legitimacy. And ultimately, when Gore came out, there were three key themes from that speech: unity, law, and healing. Those three concepts come through very loudly. And even a little joke at the beginning about he called President Bush and he conceded, and this time he wasn't going to call him back, which is what he had done on the night of the actual election when he retracted the
much to George W. Bush's irritation.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, and his brother's irritation, then the governor of Florida. But the point is that has to begin to happen politically. And yes, the court can write an opinion that attempts to gain 9 votes or 8 votes if one person is recused. But we're sort of back in that mode where we talk about Brown versus Board, right? Which has this sort of majesty to it, and it's a 9-0 decision. And it commands a certain amount of respect, but there's still tremendous pushback against that throughout an entire region of the country. And so it's not that I expect that that's necessarily going to happen here, but it's look how divided people are about Bush versus Gore even now, and about whether it ought to be used as precedent, even though the court clearly said it shouldn't be precedent. And that's with Gore having come forward. If you take that piece of it out, then we start moving into a situation which I think is highly problematic and dangerous. And that's where my concern is now, ultimately, is how we do come together, and the language and the information ecosystem that we're in right now, which is defining and making sense out of what courts or just the count of the votes are and mean.
Right. The betting markets, for whatever they were, indicated just before we came on that Vice President Biden has about a 92% chance of being the next president. In that same betting market, you could take money on the question of whether Donald Trump will ever concede, and that is 47% yes and 53% no. Ever concede the election. So let me ask.
Wait a minute, though, Dan. Is that betting taking place coterminously with counting votes in Las Vegas?
We might have some Nevadans on that, so I'm going to take.
We can talk about.
I wonder about that.
Look, I just want to say I wasn't going to bring this up, but I'm in enough trouble as a moderator because one of the anonymous attendees, and I'll just read it, said, "Can D-Rod stop calling the margins before all votes are counted?" So I'm already on the bad list. But having said that, let me encourage questions to be asked in the chat, and I really mean that. I'd love to get your questions.
Can I say something about what Jason said? Because to me,
of course, please, Carter.
The hard part about trying to go forward from here is the fact that the Senate's going to stay in the Republican hands, which means that we'll have a divided government, which
Right.
means that we're gonna go into a pandemic where there's not, where the president will have one plan. My guess is the Senate will have a very different plan in mind. The House will have a third one, and it's going to be very difficult to try to get any kind of a consensus in that environment, other than something obviously is going to have to get done. So I mean, in some ways it's particularly difficult, at least for me sitting here right at the moment, to think about how are we going to get through the next year or two? Because I think, candidly, I mean, 2020 has been tough on everybody, to be sure. I think, candidly, 2021 looks to be a much tougher year for us, both in terms of what's going to come this winter as far as the disease itself, but I think the long-term effects on the economy are going to linger through in a more serious way even into 2021. And it's, now maybe that'll be enough to bring people across the aisle to try to find solutions to what otherwise is certainly an issue that transcends politics. But if not, or if they can't get together in these circumstances, it's going to be a very long, at least 2 more years. They're going to be really hard, I think.
Well, let's start with the bad scenario and the good scenario, and I don't mean that in the partisan way it suggests. The bad scenario you just described, right? I suppose we ought to put a little asterisk because, again, hot off the presses, there does appear both Georgia Senate seats appear destined to a runoff, and there is a scenario, however unlikely it is, that those both go Democrat, in which case the Senate would be locked. Now, that's a Rube Goldberg, right, analysis to get from here to there, but let's just say it's more optimistic
Did
for
Las
the
Vegas
Democrats
give you
than
any
12
odds
hours
on
ago.
that one?
What's that? Yeah.
Las Vegas give you any odds on that one?
Yeah, they're probably not good in that regard. And then if you want to just stick with your dark winter prognostication about divided government, Carter, should also note that Democrats did not have a swimming election night in the House of Representatives. They are at last count up to 219, and NBC says that could flip plus or minus 8. So that starts to get a little close for comfort. Although I don't see anything that indicates that the Democrats won't be able to retain the House. But let me ask all three of you: is it Pollyannish to believe, as the campaign rhetoric suggested, that Vice President Biden, if he were elected as president, would be a uniter? That his experience, right, and his character and all of that, Kate, let me ask you that question, might be able to break through some of the logjam, even in a deeply divided government?
I hope so. I mean, I think that the
Right.
tenor of every remark that he has made since the election suggested, he is striking the right note, right? I mean, so, think back to President Trump's inaugural, right? Like that, the address was,
I'd prefer not to, but okay.
right?
Yeah.
Because it was so dark, it was so dystopic, right? That was the George W. Bush. That was some weird, right? Like it was but more than sort of the kind of unusual, atypical kind of rhetorical style was how sharply it broke with the general norm of inaugurals, which is you speak to the entire polity, right? It was very much to, I mean, in addition to kind of this sort of darkness, it was really about addressing his followers and not all Americans. And I think that there was something that was very self-consciously the polar opposite of that in, all of the public remarks that Joe Biden has given, whether you voted for me or not, I will be your president. I'm running as a proud Democrat, but I'll govern as an American, so very explicitly trying to invite in, all Americans, those who voted for him and those who did not. So I think that he is striking, again, the right rhetorical notes, which is really all he has right now. Obviously, he doesn't, control or touch any of the formal levers of government. I would hope that if it's a very closely divided Senate, his relationships there could be helpful. Obviously, Barack Obama also came from the Senate, but after just a minute there, as opposed to a long
drank a cup of coffee there.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And I think that so potentially that background could be significant. But I think that Obama did everything right with respect to reaching across the aisle, and it didn't get him very far in a lot of ways. Obviously at the beginning when he had a Democratic Senate and House, that things were very different. But
Sure.
but once that changed, I think it was difficult. So I hope the answer is yes. I think he is making all the right moves. I think that things like cabinet selection might make a significant difference there. But I think that he is as well positioned as a Democratic presumptive winner. Again, I don't want to sort of get ahead of over our skis on this, but that
Sure.
given that he's likely to win, I think he'd be as well positioned as anyone in the Democratic field to do that work. But I think it's going to be a difficult challenge, and I very much think that Mitch McConnell is probably the most important player here. And if he's not willing to meet Biden, I'm not even asking for halfway, but just a couple of feet down the field, there is only so much a president can do.
I assume that a couple feet down the field eliminates certainly for the next 2 years what has been all the rage on the Twitter sphere among law professors and others, which is increasing the number of justices on the court, term limits, changes in jurisdiction, that laundry list, you might even call it a wish list of many. Do you agree that that is just something that should be parked?
I mean, back burner, I think that, yes, it is clearly with a caveat that I suppose Georgia, because I think if the Democrats take both those seats, then you have 50 and then Harris as a tiebreaker. So all of a sudden then everything is on the table again. So I wouldn't say to, stop writing the white papers, I guess, because I think that people are probably furiously doing that now. I do think that there's a tactical question that some have raised about whether there was this overemphasis on court reform and expansion in particular might have been to the electoral detriment of the Democrats this cycle if it spooked people. It was talked about so much. I think that's actually an interesting and important conversation to have. But I would say that the larger conversation is worth having. In 2 years, there will be more Senate seats up. So I wouldn't say the Democrats should abandon the conversation entirely. And if in fact there is the possibility of getting some legislation done on a range of topics, even with a Republican Senate, a 6-3 Supreme Court is going to remain an obstacle potentially to some of that legislation. And so the question is no less pressing today than it was, a week ago.
So, Carter, let me follow just up on that. What do you think the current Supreme Court and the expected division in Congress we're going to see affects your wish list of legislation that might come before Congress? Whether it deals with,
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I thought Biden did the right thing in the wake of the court packing proposal to suggest that maybe it's time to have a commission take a hard look at the judiciary, and I still think they ought to do that.
Yeah.
It's now in some
look
sense,
at wider issues, look at a range of issues, right? Not just
it's not going to happen certainly for the next 2 years, and it may not happen for more years than that. But I think it's worth stepping back at this point and taking a hard look at what's the right number of justices, and should there be term limits, and are there issues about what ought to be in front of the Supreme Court and what shouldn't be, and you can go much further than that. Chevron deference, a whole lot of other important legal issues that are out there that Congress would have the authority, if it wanted to deal with it, and that a commission could take a look at and say, do this, do that. So I'd start there. I still think that's a sensible way to go. To me, as I said earlier, the crisis is the pandemic. You're not going to fix the economy. You're not going to fix anything until you get this pandemic solved. And you're going to have Congress to do that. Somebody's going to have to pass legislation. I suppose we get the border wall money back now at this point. So
right.
That'll free up a few.
Because that's already built. Yeah, exactly. But on a serious note, you say it's the crisis. I agree with that. But the votes, regardless of how it turns out, does not maybe support quite as much as the pundits suggested that was the most prominent on the minds of so many Americans. Maybe that overstates it. It was prominent in the minds of many, but it's just sort of remarkable based on the exit surveys and what we've seen, the willingness of so many Americans. And I'm not just saying to vote for Donald Trump, but to regard the coronavirus as maybe less urgency and less crisis. This may be a terribly strained analogy, but I sort of think about it in the context of climate change. Just an enormous range of folks saying it's the existential threat to our time, but doesn't appear that it motivates so many people to vote. So is there a question embedded here? Yes. Will the coronavirus sort of as a crisis maybe fade a bit in the public? Let me ask you this question, Jason. Fade a little bit in the public's attention span at the national government? Will be something that will loom there large, but we're sort of, government will turn on to other things.
In the near term, no, because I think what happens.
It can't. Yeah.
Well, it can't, and we've been distracted from it while the case count has gone over 100,000 now.
Daily. Yep.
3 days in a row. Okay, highest ever. And
Hospitalizations accompanying that. Yeah.
Yeah, and pretty soon we're going to turn back to that. And we're going to recognize that. Now, the point about McConnell, McConnell has said he's interested in some kind of coronavirus relief package. Right. My guess is there will be a place where they can come together on that. He didn't want to do that before the election because he was trying to keep his people, his Republican people in line. Some, if he had gone for it, it would have hurt them in their races. Others, it might have helped. So he packed it in and held his fire. He didn't do anything. He might be more willing to do it now. To your larger question about what comes next, I think over the long haul, the pandemic will fade as an issue. And Biden's ability to bring people together, it's very challenging. Now, here's what he brings with him that are attributes. One, I think the character that you mentioned. I think that he is somebody who is willing to listen to people. He does understand the other side, but he also brings with him and will be forced by the people who have supported him to continue to fight for the things that they want him to fight for, right? So he's going to embody all those things. That's good. He's also a little bit of a creature of the institution in a way that Obama wasn't. So when we think about forging consensus in the Senate, he probably has more of a likelihood to do that. He's more willing to spend the time there maybe than somebody like President Obama was.
But if I can jump in on that point, part of that skill set involves toggling to the center, right?
There's
in a way that he's got enormous, yeah.
Yes, now, and there's the issue. So what are the challenges? There are many people who, even if at the minute we end tonight, victory is declared and Joe Biden wins, supporters of his who will not see what happened will see it as a victory, but not a success.
Right.
They will see it as triumph, but not repudiation. And because of that, they are also somewhat cynical about the process and where we are. And the half of America that didn't vote for Biden, wondering how that's possible.
Yep.
Worse yet, on the other side, he is facing a president who probably will not concede, a core of followers who believe he shouldn't concede. And at any given hour on Fox News last night, for example, which I watched, a series of claims about the system is rigged, that the courts are taking over, that places like Detroit, that are the worst run places in the world, are the ones that are in charge of this election at this point.
Right.
It is an information environment of it's disinformation, distrust, and dislike. You walk into the Oval Office that day, your job is to bring all that together on both sides. You're going to need to call on every skill and power that you have at that point and deal with Mitch McConnell in the Senate. So it is a formidable task. I think he's up to a lot of it, but we shouldn't be surprised if along the way he's tacking his way as he goes. And the question is going to be, can he maintain his support as he does that?
So let me ask a question that Biden can't have anything to do with, even if he is elected president. You talk about walking to the Oval Office, which he's not going to be able to do until January. And I'm talking about what's happening today, tomorrow, the next day. You and I had a discussion about this offline. This emergence of this movement called Stop the Steal, which emerged really as recently as early this morning. This was a group of folks that took to social media and Facebook until they were banned a few hours ago from Facebook. In record time, they got almost 400,000 followers under the rubric of civil war and armed insurrection, right? And Donald Trump Jr. 2 hours ago tweeted that his father should go to total war. That was banned from Twitter, but that will continue. So we have our problems cut out for us in the coming days, right, with respect to divisions and factions. And is it an oversimplification, let me ask you this question, Kate, to suggest that it's got to be Republican leadership that stands up to that before we even get to the president-elect, if Biden is in fact the president-elect? And what would that look to in terms of, and the media and others who need to stand up?
Yeah, I think that the response of Republican leadership in the next couple of days, maybe even next couple of hours. So since we've been having this conversation, the president, right before we got on this webinar, the president gave some remarks, and I gather that they involved additional, although I haven't been able to watch any of them, that they involved him kind of doubling down on allegations of theft and fraud.
He used the word steal, was the very first sentence that came out of his mouth about the election. We won this election and they're trying to steal it.
Wow. Well, and look, he, struck the same note at 2 a.m. on election night when he came out. And I do think that while we haven't seen a clear repudiation of that rhetoric by Republican leadership, there certainly hasn't been a rush to support the president. And in some ways, that's the most distance that they have really been willing to, kind of create between themselves and him in the nearly 4 years that they have been engaged in this endeavor together. So I think that is somewhat significant, actually. I think even Pence following Trump seemed not to strike the same note. And I think that so far, the kind of the group that is kind of parroting these, we should be clear, like really ungrounded and unsubstantiated claims of fraud and theft, are primarily the president's very inner circle of advisors, many of whom are his relatives, and not many more. I mean, I did think that it was actually really disheartening that John James, the Michigan Senate candidate, who was narrowly defeated by Senator Peters, who did
It's not conceded. Yeah.
And he has not conceded, and he has declined to concede in terms that are, fairly similar to the president's terms about, suggestions of fraud and disenfranchisement. So that is one, non-inner circle individual who seems to be sort of on board. But I think even it sounds as though, former Senator Rick Santorum, who's on CNN during, doing some commentary during or right after the speech, seemed to be sort of pretty sharp in his condemnation of it. I've been on air a lot on ABC the last couple of days with Chris Christie, who remains an inner circle member and was very critical of the president's 2 a.m. speech on election night and his remarks since. So I do think that now.
And by the way, just jump in. Someone a few hours ago, maybe it was one of the family members, said, "We really need our James Baker." And then James Baker said they should count all the votes.
Right.
So,
yeah. And I think that and that's sort of to come back to Bush v. Gore for just a minute, like, you had there, I mean, the situation was different in many ways, but, you did have kind of this cadre of conservative legal superstars, right, litigating this case. And I do think that the absence of any kind of conservative legal powerhouses on any of these, really small bore lawsuits that have been filed in Georgia and Pennsylvania and, and other places, challenging various kind of procedural dimensions of the count to date, is also noteworthy. So now that's not, an express condemnation, but the sort of unwillingness to associate themselves with some of these outlandish legal claims, I think, is significant. And the failure to, again, back the president up on the part of Republican leadership, I think matters. But I do think that in the coming hours and days, something a little bit more than silence will be required.
And can I build on something that?
Of course. Yeah, please.
So I mentioned Fox a minute ago. And one of the more interesting developments of the past few days has been the sometimes consistent, but we're seeing it here, a little bit of a dichotomy between what happens at night among some of the opinion folks on Fox versus what's happened during the day.
Right.
During the day, what's been happening, and it's actually started election night with their election desk and calling Arizona.
Right. It's remarkable.
Right. Which Trump was irate about and tried to get a retraction, if you believe the reporting by Vanity Fair, from Murdoch directly, and they wouldn't give it to him. And if you watch the day part there, and we talk about people forming opinions about the legitimacy of the voting process, what you see there is a much more mixed message. You see a series of people who are reporting and are kind of showing remote aspects of what might be considered fraud or something that's could be questioned. But then at the same time, the reporters are coming out and saying there's no actual evidence of fraud. And they're actually saying those things. And so I think to Kate's point there about kind of what's happened over the past few days, if you think about the kind of validators that are out there for some of the claims that the president and Rudy Giuliani have made, we have Republicans like Mike DeWine and Chris Christie and Adam Kinzinger here in Illinois who push back against that. But we also kind of have that House organ of Fox, which is split right now. And so as we look forward in the next few days about how much of those claims will be amplified, it will be interesting to watch how much of the actual news organization of that entity follows suit and how much does not.
Yep. So Carter, let me twist that a little bit. And I'm thinking of the Lincoln Project in particular. So maybe the low-hanging fruit and the very important, not to trivialize it, is condemnation and quick, I agree with Kate, quick condemnation in the coming days and the coming hours. But when the dust settles on that condemnation, leaving aside whether Trump concedes or doesn't concede, there's the repair of the Republican Party. And one of the messages that has come out crystal clear is Biden didn't win by 8 votes. He's not going to win by more than 8%. Closely divided country with the Republican Party arguably in shambles from that. So what does the repair look like? What is in that heavily fraught environment? Because the Trump movement, it's going to still be an enormously powerful movement.
It will be, although you would hope at least that there would be some effort by some elected members in the Republican Party to distance themselves now that the man no longer has the kind of power that he had. And he still has obviously significant political influence, but doesn't actually have real power to move money in different directions, at least not the United States money, in ways that can have enormous political impact as well. And so the to my mind, quite remarkable steadfastness of the Republicans to sort of stay with President Trump's agenda through the 4 years of his presidency, you would hope would kind of lose some of its momentum at this stage. And that given that he's no longer in a decision-making role, they're facing a true national crisis. And even if we get past the pandemic, you're still going to have the long-term economic effects. There are a lot of businesses that are not going to bounce back from this anytime soon. There are entire areas of the economy that will simply disappear, and you're not, that whole process is going to be incredibly expensive. Somebody's going to have to step up on the Republican side, other than the former president, and take some leadership in terms of coming up with some answers to some of those problems. I mean, President Trump was not great at coming up with plans. It would be nice for some Republicans now to think about what are solutions that are consistent with the Republican Party norms, that will actually be solutions to the problems, to real problems, because there are real problems that this country is going to face for the next 2 years.
Let me read this question verbatim rather than try to characterize it. It's so very important. Before President Trump spoke today, I felt real fear that his remarks would incite violence, especially in Detroit after the attempted kidnapping of Governor Whitmer. The armed protesters in Arizona were a terrifying premonition of potential riots. What would you say to Black and brown alums who are justifiably afraid in this moment? We start with you, Kate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a great question. And I think that it sounds as though, again, not having witnessed it in real time, the president, if anything, probably ratcheted up that rhetoric. And there is obviously reason for concern. I mean, I do think there is cause for hope in that the president had been striking this note in the weeks up to the election. And the problems that we on election day were not of the widespread intimidation variety. We saw long lines, we saw, machine issues and a water main break in Atlanta and, polls opening late and things like that. But it was actually kind of remarkable how unheeded those his early calls for, large scale presence at the polls, and what seemed to be a not so thinly veiled effort to kind of get suppressive Trump supporters out to polling places, and he mentioned Philadelphia and Detroit, cities in which you obviously have high Black and brown populations, in which voter suppression and intimidation are obviously not sort of new phenomena. And yet that did not on a widespread basis happen. Again, not to discount the seriousness of any incidents of voter intimidation, but it just didn't materialize. So I think that we take some comfort in that the rhetoric is mostly rhetoric, right? It is not to say it doesn't have the potential to be translated into really dangerous and violent action. And I do think that it is concerning that one of the entities that should be kind of the most vigilant about preventing that kind of translation of rhetoric to action, the Department of Justice, isn't one in which we can have confidence, because Attorney General Barr has been, not an independent head of the Justice Department, but really kind of a henchman of the president. Although too, the Department of Justice
in recent,
and that has been significant. There's been no pre-election, no October surprise from the Department of Justice, no deployment of DOJ officials in ways that might potentially, involve DOJ interference in counting processes. So also say the fears, the concerns are extremely well grounded. I do think there is some hope to take in our experience to date, which is the rhetoric is not, we're not seeing it translate on a widespread basis into action.
Right. And I'm thinking about this. All of us live in big, in highly fraught urban areas, right? Probably the experience in New York, Washington, D.C., and here in Chicago, where in my neighborhood, they were boarding up buildings and all of that. Is we can hope and pray that doesn't become seriously out of control. Jason, someone on the who's anonymous, was probably one of your current or former students, asked you a question. Could we so I'm going to ask it. Could we re-implement the fairness doctrine to try to quell some unrest driven by the the media. That's an oldie but a goodie, right? The fairness doctrine. Let me take the question and broaden it to, what we can do with respect to or ought to do with respect to the media to quell some of this unrest.
So
if that's accurate, that it's been unrest driven by the media.
And look, I wouldn't write off the fairness doctrine as a way to require the opposite position to be taken on a broadcast. But I think the larger issue here is, and it's not uncommon, we ought to place it in some historical context. During the Alien and Sedition Act era, around the turn into the 18th century, into the 18th century, around the Civil War period, the media was very much split in this country between papers that took one point of view and papers that took another. And you read the paper that reflected your view of the world. And that's not to say maybe that's optimal, but it is to say that it is realistic and it's probably a part of democracy. So I think over the long run, what it comes back down to is the individual ability to open yourself to other ideas, but also the role of leaders to make sure that they are not exacerbating tensions between people. Because I think when that happens, people go to their corners and they don't want to listen anymore. In fact, all the research tells us that people want to stay in their corners because it creates a release of dopamine inside of people that makes people more, when they become excited, and that is invigorating for people, and it's an emotional response that people tend to like. So leaders have to fight against that and try to appeal to what it is that actually brings people together. And that's why when somebody comes forward and speaks, not in terms of just a legal system or a counting system or a voting system, but speaks in a calm way and assures people that democracy actually means something, and that the fundamental tenet of democracy is voting, if nothing else, and that more people are voting than ever, and that we're going to count every one of those votes, that's about the most crucial kind of messaging that anybody in a leadership position can provide. And those who undermine that messaging are those that make it more likely that people are going to keep going to their corners and keep seeking out the information that they want to confirm their views. So we can think about regulations, we can think about legal mechanisms, we can certainly think about all the questions we've had about regulating these platforms, but ultimately this is going to be, to some extent, about individual choice of listeners, and individual choice of those who are in positions to influence the most listeners.
And you include the media in that, right? I mean, that in that leadership role, yeah.
Yeah, I do. And on the previous question about people of color and feeling safe, that to me seems perfectly understandable and reasonable given the current situation. And to feel unsafe both physically but also emotionally and mentally as well. I will simply point out one piece of information in addition to what Kate said, which might be taken as good news. If we're to believe the exit polling, the Black Lives Matter movement in the exit polling across the country had a 57% approval rating from people across the country, across the political spectrum. And given the way the vote turned out, we might have questioned that. And that might give us some reason for pause, why people voted the way they did. But I think when we think about social change and we think about the way people begin to regard each other and movements, I think that's a good thing. That's a positive thing. And maybe that's one thing we can think about in a positive way going forward.
I'm going to take off my moderator hat for just 20 seconds and say I would answer that question myself as broadening it to include not only fundamental questions of safety in response to potential or real violence, because like Kate, I've been reassured, cautiously optimistic that maybe we won't see that. But to come back to something Carter said, safety also means a safety net. And we need stimulus. We need to rescue big parts of the economy. It's not just the economy is in shambles in large part because of the coronavirus, but that is disproportionately affected people of color. We know they get sick at a greater rate, contract the virus. We know that they are hospitalized and die at a greater rate. So without trying to be Pollyannish about reassurance, Black and brown people need safety that comes from governmental policy, and policies made at the federal level, at the state level, to really deal with these enormous and extraordinary challenges that are being faced. An oldie but a goodie, Carter. I'm going to ask you this question too. Do we now beat up on the Electoral College in light of this in light of this result? Are we revisiting the question someone also asked about low voter turnout relative to eligible voters? I know that's a perennial. Is there any lessons that we've learned from this experience that calls those kinds of institutional apparatus into question?
Well,
How we vote and how,
yeah, well, I think the good news is that we tried. This was a very grand experiment, and not voting the old-fashioned way, going to the polls, and we tried ballots and mail-in ballots, and it seems to have worked remarkably well in terms of getting a lot of people there. I mean, I was at the polls for probably 6 of the hours, and the number of people coming into those polls were pretty small numbers, at least in Northern Virginia, because the very large numbers had already voted well before that time. And I think without a president berating the process, which I don't think would happen again in 4 years, we actually ought to see more of that. And I think that will go a long way toward improving at least that aspect of it. I mean, I think the Electoral College clearly has outlived its purpose, but I also think that there's zero chance that I would be able to, that anybody's going to be able to do anything about it. Certainly not in the next 4 years. You're going to have to get out of a much less polarized world than the one we're in before you're going to, I think, take that on. But the one thing I did want to say, if we jump back to the 2 questions, I think
Please.
If anyone can give not only people of color, but frankly, all citizens who are probably a little anxious about the risk of violence still coming out of this, anybody could help on that, it would be the Attorney General. He is the one person who should condemn any form of violence under all circumstances, and he ought to do it candidly, preemptively. You shouldn't wait for the first act of violence to happen and say, well, we're going to bring the full force of the law to, you should realize that there's a risk of it. And that the president.
Can I press on that, Carter? I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but also the threat of violence, is that his role too, is to get in there and say even this rhetoric is dangerous?
I don't know whether you want, that may be, I mean, I think that would be great. I think, but that he can just, I think you can only tell the president that directly and say, you're not helping things by doing this, because you're going to create a lot of work for me in the long run, because we are going to have, if this breaks out that way, it's going to be the federal government's going to end up having to enforce a lot of the laws under these circumstances. But I do think he certainly create a deterrent to some who might think about violence as an outgrowth of this and say that's not an acceptable response to the situation we're in, and that we will in fact enforce the laws to the fullest if people engage in any behavior like that. Because I don't see the president doing that, and I don't know who else could do it in a convincing way other than the Attorney General of the United States at this point. So my hope is he'll recognize that that's something he could and should do.
Dan, can I jump in on the Electoral College just for a second?
Please, Kate. I was going to come to you next.
Oh, great. Yeah, I mean, I am largely in agreement with Carter that the college has outlived its useful, but it's to the extent that you even can see that it ever had any utility or served any valid function. I don't think I think that's contestable too. But certainly I would love to see an active debate, as we've had periodically in recent decades, about abolition of the Electoral College. But even short of that, because I do think it won't be on the front burner, I think you could imagine some states seeing what is still unfolding in this election cycle and saying maybe Maine and Nebraska are onto something, right? Because any state could decide that rather than just using a winner-take-all system of awarding all of its Electoral College votes to the winner of that state's popular vote, it gives its votes in a proportional way to the winners, say, of individual congressional districts or any other method of allocation. It is within the state's discretion to decide how to award its electoral votes. And there were moments over the last 72 hours when it looked like Nebraska 2 or the one main congressional district that it was in some play could actually tip the election. And those districts did get some attention from the candidates, which as a state like Nebraska would not normally, because the logic of the Electoral College means that solidly red and solidly blue states don't get any attention from the candidates for the presidency because it's only the states that are swing or battleground states that matter. But you could all of a sudden make yourself really relevant, and all of a sudden then your priorities end up kind of discussed and debated in the context of presidential elections in a way that an example that Larry Lessig gives all the time is think about the relative kind of discussion of coal versus solar energy in presidential campaign cycles. Well, California doesn't matter, and that's, you know, in the sort of the Western states where the solar energy kind of is concentrated, that sector is concentrated, just aren't important states in the context of the logic of a presidential election, and the coal states are. But like in terms of the percentage of the economy that solar versus coal power constitute, solar is vastly more actually. So, you know, it has all these policy
And by contrast, you have the
distortions.
ethanol discussions in the primary system that's way out of proportion.
Totally. So it actually does sort of warp policy, at least policy debates, and I think actual policy making. Anyway, so I feel like states could take that lesson, and maybe we could see a couple more Maine and Nebraskas, which would improve the system.
Yeah, you know, that would be an interesting thing as a compact as well, I would think.
Right.
You could, you know, it's one of those things where a single state might have a hard time giving up the winner take all concept, but if you could get a group of states, you wouldn't need, I don't think you need all 50, but if you if you get 5, 10, 15 states to do it, and then you'd have a solid experiment in place, and then the other states could see what happened when you went down that particular path. And that would be actually quite interesting. That'd be fun.
Interesting. Well, your idea of fun, Carter, I don't know, but it would be positive and fun. Any encouraging note to leave us with, Jason? We're running close to the end of time, but I pick on you in part because you started us out really with such a note of hope in terms of bringing us together, even though it seems we're far from doing that. So I'd like you to close on a note of hope too.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. You know, I think it goes back to something I said a minute ago for me, which is there can be a lot of things that we disagree about within democracy. There can be a lot of questions we have about the legitimacy of particular proceedings. But one thing that did happen this time around is we have the highest percentage of people who've ever voted, at least since 1900 in this country. That's a good thing. And I think Carter touched on it a minute ago with vote by mail. If you think about the amount of transition that was undertaken in a very short amount of time to ready people to vote in a way that most of us had treated as the exception in how we vote. And it became the dominant way to vote, at least for a large group of people. And in a way, maybe what we might realize is it's actually a way to gin up turnout. It becomes easier for people to vote. And we can have a much longer discussion about voter suppression and a whole bunch of other issues. But when you boil it down, a lot of people voted. And on the heels of all the social protests that happened this summer, as aggrieved as we are in many ways in democracy, in some ways, the patient shows irretrievable signs of life. And maybe that's a good thing.
And we voted in a pandemic. Some folks stood in line to vote. Some folks dropped their their ballots at the voting spot in Harris County in Texas. They drove many, many miles to have to do that. That's, with everything else going on, an extraordinary number of people voted.
Yeah.
Which is just well, this has been terrific. And I want to thank Carter and Kate and Jason and Northwestern Alumni Association for putting this program together, and also all the other programs that hopefully shed some very, very useful and welcome light, and not only heat on this. And so go Cats, and thank you for all the folks who tuned in. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Stay safe.
Thanks, Dan.